Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Anita Verisveitia, Professor and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our final event in the GST's Fall 2020 program. Before we get started, just a few quick reminders that the chat function has been disabled, but that you can submit your questions into the queue at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And you can also enable captions by clicking the closed caption button right next to it. We invite you all to tune in for our public programs next semester. All of the lectures will be online, and you can visit the GST website in the coming weeks to learn more about the spring 2021 public programs and also to view the video recordings of past programs. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Sylvester Baxter lecture for the fall 2021. Sylvester Baxter was a journalist and writer with an interest in the administration of cities, and who along with Charles Eliot, helped put into place the legal frameworks that would result in the creation of a new type of metropolitan scale public landscape, Boston's Metropolitan Park System of 1892. Behind Baxter and Eliot's work was the observation that market forces could not be counted on to look after what had already become a fragmented landscape, plagued by polluted waters, extraction, ecosystem fragmentation, all of which they thought was a matter of public concern. Legislation ensued, and much was accomplished to protect and reverse the damage done. However, fast forward to the present, a moment characterized by acute and enduring environmental and social inequities, it is clear that we must look beyond government and beyond the market for ways to serve environment and society in an equitable manner. And it is in this context of necessary and urgent critique that we have the honor of welcoming Professor Sheila Foster to give our annual Sylvester Baxter Lecture. Professor Foster is the Scott K. Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy and Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Her research in the area of environmental law and justice, urban land use law and policy, and climate justice are all topics that have been at the center of discussions at the GST generally and within the Department of Landscape Architecture in particular. In her work, Professor Foster introduces the idea of the commons as a framework to open up possibilities of more inclusive and equitable forms of city making. Together with her collaborator, Christian Iaioni, they have innovatively applied and transformed a concept that originates in an ethic of land and environment to a new vision of an equitable city, what they call the city as commons. As director of the Laboratory for the Governance of the Commons, known as the LabGov, she studies innovative and collaborative forms of urban governance. Of special note is the Co-Cities Project, which investigates new forms of collaborative city making that lead urban areas toward new types of participatory urban governance, and with it to economic growth and social innovation. They have conducted research in over 100 cities worldwide. Her publications on this topic include The City as Commons, Collective Action and the Urban Commons, The City as an Ecological Space, Social Capital and Urban Land Use, and Ostrom in the City, Design Principles for the Urban Commons. These and others form the conceptual pillars for her forthcoming book, which will be published by MIT Press, titled The Co-Cities, Empowering Equitable and Self-Sustaining Communities Through Land and Resource, which is also co-authored with Christian Iaioni. She currently serves as chair of the Global Parliament of Mayors Advisory Committee, on the advisory board of New York University's Marin Institute of Urban Management, and on the New York City panel on climate change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sheila Foster. The title of her lecture is Co-Cities, Imagining the City as Commons.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you to everyone who is attending tonight. I am so honored to be here. Everything that Anita has just said about my career really reflects what an intellectual journey this has been for me, both in terms of theorizing the commons and cities as commons, but also in traveling around the world and applying the concept in a variety of contexts. And so my talk tonight really hopes to pull on both the intellectual strand and the really pragmatic and even global strand, but with a focus on the US. And I look forward to your comments and questions. But before I start, I do want to give a shout out to my LabGov collaborator, Christian, but also all of the students and our collaborators all over the world who have really fed into this project, way too many to name. But I hope that you'll see as I walk through our thinking, both our intellectual thinking and also to offer you examples of what all of this means, that it is something that really could not have been brought about except for collaborative efforts. So I really look forward to sharing my thoughts with you and to hearing your thoughts. So right now, about 40 people in Philadelphia, mostly single mothers with young children, occupy boarded up vacant homes in North Philadelphia. The owner of these previously occupied homes or previously held homes is the Philadelphia Housing Authority, the PHA, which had no plan to renovate them and bring them to action and had planned to let them sit idle. So a coalition including Occupy PHA, Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, and the Revolutionary Workers Collective began quietly moving in families. This coalition of advocates argue that the PHA, the largest landlord in Pennsylvania, has become indistinguishable from a private developer, leading to gentrification and displacement while ignoring the needs of the low-income residents of the city. In orchestrating this occupation, advocates took their cues from Moms for Housing, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, a collective of Black mothers who are homeless and marginally housed in Oakland, California. Another group of mothers in Los Angeles took similar inspiration from the Oakland Collective earlier this year under the name Reclaiming Our Homes. These housing insecure families began to move into vacant homes owned by Caltrans, the state transportation authority. And so this is a movement across the country, a movement to occupy vacant homes to address homelessness and housing instability at a time when the COVID pandemic has made paying rent for so many unimaginable. This is also an important connection to what some would call the right to the city. In fact, these mothers and activists frame their fight for housing as a human right. First articulated by French philosopher Henri Lefebvre and embraced by a number of progressive academics, most notably David Harvey, the right to the city is an important framework through which citizens can reclaim or reappropriate city space, inhabit and share its spaces, and actively participate in the formation and use of city space. For Lefebvre, the right to the city is about the struggle between exchange or market value and use or everyday value, or between the city as a site of accumulation and the city as an inhabited place that nurtures the needs of its inhabitants. And so the long-term goal for many housing justice activists is to remove this land and these structures from the speculative market entirely and to put it into the hands of communities that need them. And that's where Moms for Housing achieved a really important victory recently. A few weeks after their eviction, Wedgwood, the town, agreed to sell the house to the Oakland Community Land Trust, which acquires land for the benefit of low-income communities. Today, what I want to do is to connect this claim of right to the city and this occupation with our framework. And that is the framework of the co-city and the idea of the city as commons. The idea of the city as commons is intended to move beyond a rights-based framework to a rethinking of space and spaces to which rights-based claims seek to open up. In other words, thinking of the city as a commons is a way to acknowledge that the city is generative, capable of providing for different social and economic needs of its populations, much like other common resources, the air, the water, fisheries, etc., are generative, capable of providing for folks' needs. Reframing the city as a commons is a way to imagine the city as an infrastructure or a platform on which participants can share resources, collaborate together, co-produce, co-create, and co-govern a variety of shared physical, cultural, knowledge, environmental, and digital resources, supported by often open data and technologies and guided by principles of distributive justice. We've used the idea of the commons to extract a set of design principles for the framework that we call the co-city, which is rooted in what we call urban co-governance, creating settings using the city as a platform in which communities interact with the state and other actors to co-create and co-govern urban resources like land, buildings, and even utilities and wireless networks, something I'll talk about later. These bottom-up, constructed, shared resources, or urban commons, are increasingly taking the form of community land trusts, new forms of co-housing, limited equity cooperatives, and shared digital and energy networks. And it's characterized by a move away from a top-down oriented world in which the state, in this case, the local government or local agencies, monopolistically control these resources to a horizontally organized one in which autonomous arrangements from communities and other actors are allowed to exist and become nested within the framework of the city, and with the support often of local policies and public resources to create what we call a polycentric network of urban commons. Now, the framework of the co-city emerges out of, as Anita mentioned, the empirical part of this project, which has now surveyed over 100 cities and over 500 cases within those cities. And what we've done in this decade-long investigation is to look at the ways that collectively shared and collaboratively stewarded resources can be created and sustained in different political, social, and economic environments. And so at the end of the talk, I will come back to the principles that we've extracted from this empirical studies. And these design principles, which is a term we borrow from Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, whose methodological footsteps in that we walk in, she, of course, found in her Nobel Prize winning work instances of long-lasting stewarded natural resources all over the world. And she also extracted design principles from her examples. But first, let me back up and start from the beginning of my intellectual journey and why it's important, I think, to focus on cities and the land and to treat the land and infrastructure of cities as a commons. So the first place to start is with the reality and the truism that the world is urbanizing at an unprecedented rate. Economic opportunity is increasingly concentrated in major metropolitan areas. And as a result, urban land values are at historically high levels. What this chart shows is that 20 metro areas in the United States generate over half of our gross domestic product. And within those, the 10 largest metro areas generate 34% of the country's GDP. If each of these areas were countries, in fact, what we would see is that the 17 largest metro economies, would rank in the world's 50 largest economies. The New York metro area produces 4% more economic output than Canada, Los Angeles than Mexico, Chicago, the third largest metro economy. Its GDP is higher than Switzerland's, and the Boston, Cambridge, Newton metropolitan area produces more economic output than the country of Austria. So it should come as no surprise to you to learn that urban land values are at a tremendous level these days. They add up to more than 25 trillion, the value of America's urban land, roughly more than double the nation's total economic output, or GDP. And nearly half of that total value is packed into just 5 superstar metro areas. You guessed it, New York, LA, San Francisco, Washington, and Chicago. Now, the fact that the rising value of land and resulting economic opportunity is concentrated in a relatively small group of cities here and around the world has led scholars to worry about the exclusionary tendency of cities, in particular megacities, and the model of property-centered urban development and growth that privileges developers, existing property owners, and speculators to the detriment of non-property owners. And the exclusionary nature of these cities is, of course, aggravated by the temptation of local governments to commodify and sell off their land, often to the highest bidders. And this actually may be understandable from the perspective of some local governments that are relatively powerless to raise their own revenue and taxes. But nevertheless, it poses the question that sociologist Saskia Sassen provocatively asked a few years ago, when she says, who owns the city in an era of corporatizing access and control over urban land and the corporate buying of whole pieces of cities, which is transforming the small and or public into the large and or private across so many cities around the world. And she details a post-2008 pattern in many cities around the world in which large corporate entities are acquiring whole blocks of underutilized or underutilized land. I'm sorry, my slides are a bit out of order. Land in cities around the world to build high-end luxury commercial and residential space. And what you see here is one of the many examples, Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn. She points to one of the largest multinational Chinese developers purchased the land for $5 billion, and the project, as you see on the right, includes a new Barclays Sports Centers and 17 high-rise buildings, as well as some affordable housing units. Before this development, part of the site was occupied by a mixture of modest factories and industrial services, modest neighborhoods and artist studios and venues that I think it's obvious are no longer there. But although provocatively frames Sassen's point, right, highlights a tension that's playing out in cities around the world over what to do with underutilized, vacant, abandoned land and property over which local governments have or can assert control and ownership. And it's not just huge land developments that raise this tension. Going back to Detroit. This is my birthplace and a city which I'm sure we know a lot about. Vast amounts of land in cities, in so-called minimal cities like Detroit, that were once privately owned, held and managed, but at some point have fallen out of private hands into and have ended up in the domain of the local authority, usually through tax delinquency or white flight to the suburbs and decades of disinvestment in urban neighborhoods. These are ubiquitous in schools, in places like Detroit, and perhaps more ubiquitous than people understand. We're talking about cities both that are declining and that are resurging. And this includes New York City. Now I'll go forward. Look at New York City, and this is from a comptroller study of the amount of available land in New York City. And so even magnet cities like New York have vacancy rates that range from 5 to 15%. And this includes Sunbelt cities and cities on the coast, as well as cities on the coast. Now, as I said, the public authority is actively trying to place the land back into productive use by acquiring title to these properties, often putting them in what are called land banks. But in doing so, it does, again, raise this tension between exchange and use values. So consider, for instance, the New York City Comptroller's audit of this city-owned land that you see on this chart. Not including private lots that were under foreclosure, but land that is actually in the city's hands, some of which has been vacant for 50 years or more. Because New York City is in the midst of a housing affordability crisis that includes thousands of New Yorkers sleeping in shelters, the audit by the comptroller suggested that the city should first of all establish a land bank in which to place this property with the promise to develop over 50,000 units of permanently affordable housing on these lots, and perhaps a smaller subset of privately owned tax delinquent properties that the city could foreclose to add to that. So far, so good in my view. There's a dire need for affordable housing in most cities, and using public land to meet that makes sense. But where I give pause, and what gave me pause is, and what I want to challenge is what the comptroller said in a press conference when he announced the results of the audit. He said, when the city owns the property, we get to call the shots about how land is developed and for whom, which is why these properties are so valuable. Now, on the one hand, I'm a legal scholar, I teach property law. This is a pretty straightforward statement of property ownership. An owner of property is said to hold all of the sticks or legal entitlements in the bundle of rights, including the right to possess, control, exclude, and to dispose of it. On the other hand, our work raises the question, is it really the case here that the state, here the local government, should behave as if it were a private property owner, claiming unfettered discretion and control over city land and other public assets? How might we think about ownership of this property? In other words, land and physical resources that end up in the public domain. So let me just geek out here for a minute. There's a lack of attention to this actually in legal scholarship. That is, it's clear this is some kind of public property, but beyond that, there's really little clarity about the legal character of public here. Do members of the public have any claim on this land and property once it falls into the local government's hands? In many respects, this type of vacant and available land in cities, as we've argued, is property in transition. In other words, it's up for grabs. And when it's up for grabs, often the way that communities treat this land, as Moms for Housing and other activists have done, is to treat it as an open access resource, or what scholars call a common pool resource, or a traditional commons that can serve the needs of underserved communities that lack green space and healthy food options. So they're transferred into urban farms and community gardens, or they are, again, used for housing. In places like Detroit, for example, many predominantly Black community members want more control over this land as they're stewarding it, right, to remake spaces and to rebuild their communities. The local government, on the other hand, is assembling and holding the land, as I mentioned, in land banks. To some observers, the city has no problem selling hundreds of parcels of vacant lots to large corporations to expand its commercial urban tree nurseries, while small-scale, long-established Black farms in the city have had difficulty purchasing the land on which they're farming from the city land bank. Again, these Black farmers have stewarded acres of farm sites that serve the needs of food-insecure homes and neighborhoods. Many Black communities believe that this land belongs to the urban commons, which is the Black man's land, they've said, and serves as a site of historical and collective memory. They argue that too often publicly held land that has been maintained and rendered productive by communities becomes vulnerable to extraction, leading to commodification of their labor and revealing, as some have argued, the work of racial capitalism. Others argue that the processes that contemporary forms of land dispossession from urban commoners operate much like the enclosure of common land in late 16th and early 17th century Britain, by removing quote unquote tenants from common property previously available to them and converting their property into privately owned parcels. So one view of the land is that when a private owner abandons a land, it reverts back to the commons or state of nature, the original land on which the city has built. William Cronin's brilliant book on Chicago reminds us that before the city, there was the land, right? His wonderful account describes how people came to the land that was formed out of a barren landscape, or formed the city out of a barren landscape by people who did so through their cultural and economic exchanges. And as one noted property scholar argues in reference to Garrett Hardin's famous Tragedy of the Commons, the city analog to placing an additional cow on the commons is the decision to locate one's firm or household along with the privately owned structure that contains it in a particular position within an urban area. In other words, the city is literally a commons, an open space, which people come and occupy and build up over time. This kind of argument also resonates, of course, in John Locke's treatise, as many of you probably know, on government, in which he gives nod to the idea that surplus property should revert to being in the commons. He said, God gave the world to man in common. Whatever one takes from the state of nature through their labor is theirs. In a less celebrated portion of his work, however, he also wrote that whatever is beyond this, more than his share, belongs to others. So in other words, you can't claim more than you can utilize. Whatever remains idle, you leave behind to others. So one problem with this rule, one might think, is that it has distributional consequences, right? Even Locke tempered his view that mixing one's labor with the commons gives one a property right in whatever they have created, with the proviso that at least where there is enough in good left in common for others. In other words, allowing some to take from the commons inevitably reduces the amount available to others, making some better off than others. And of course, this brings us to the central problem of the tragedy of the common. 50 years ago, Garrett Hardin warned that freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. Open access commons, he argued, risk rivalry, overconsumption, and even destruction of the resource by self-interested actors. So in my past work, I've argued that, of course, vacant urban land, including urban parks, there's a wonderful book about Central Park that speaks to this, is vulnerable to tragedy, vulnerable to competing and rivalrous uses. Some in the community can utilize it in ways that add value to the surrounding community and to produce goods for that community. But in other instances, others may conduct illegal activities, dumping, crime, which clearly does not add value. So there's a tension between saying that the city is an open access space of commons and public spaces within it, and the distributional reality that sometimes there is not enough to always go around. So the other option is to think about abandoned vacant land, public space in cities, as we do with the natural environment. We trust the government to hold Yosemite Park, the Grand Canyon, our natural resources for us under what's called the public trust doctrine, right? So we might think about public or property that falls back into the government's hand, the state's hands, as them being a trustee, right? The government holding it and being limited in using, transferring, and selling that property, except where it serves the public good. And in fact, the origin of the public trust idea was not in the protection of natural resources, but in fact, 19th centuries rooted it actually in the urban environment. A very famous Supreme Court case, Meriwether, the quote here, it says, "In its streets, wharfs, cemeteries, hospitals, courthouses, and other public buildings, the municipal corporation has no proprietary rights distinct from the trust for the public. It holds them for public use," etc. Unfortunately, the common law public trust doctrine is no longer routinely applied to city streets or public squares, and certainly not to what we call proprietary property in cities, that is, these structures and vacant land. Most courts simply refuse to apply the doctrine to those resources. As one state court said, simply stated, an alley is not a natural resources. So what that's left us with is to thinking again, thinking in a public trust way, but having to build out a notion of stewardship for shared city resources and public spaces, not really rooted in any kind of accepted legal doctrine, but rather in a conceptual idea of the city, as a place that can be stewarded by the people that live there. And so what does this mean? We've equated the commons with a conception of these resources and assets that resonates in the idea of the public trust, but it doesn't center the state as a guardian of those resources. Right? The concept of stewardship, in fact, has a long intellectual pedigree rooted in the custodial relationship, which can encompass duties and rights that individuals have over a resource that's held or managed on behalf of others. It involves, the idea of stewardship involves recognizing not simply new types of property rights in urban infrastructure and resources, but importantly, new forms of property and resource governance. So what that means in the urban context is property stewardship is created by removing the profit motive and by allocating rights and responsibilities in a way that gives stewards decision-making control over resources in a manner similar to ownership, but without emphasis on individual exchange value of property. So in other words, stewardship encourages co-management, co-development, co-governance for the common good. It's not anti-development. It's not anti-wealth building. However, it does discourage economic development in the absence of community building. It privileges the right to be included in community over the right to exclude from collective resources, and it favors collective community wealth building over individual wealth maximization. And so the obvious emerging model that it has emerged in cities all over the world, really, but particularly in urban communities, is a model that I want to spend a little time talking about, and that's the community land trust model that embodies this idea of stewardship. CLTs are nonprofit entities set up to work with local governments to transfer available land or lots and to oversee that development or preservation of that land and the use of the land for affordable housing, commercial buildings, or green space. The CLT is a steward because the nonprofit entity holds title to the land, but enters into long-term ground leases with those who build or utilize the land for apartments, homes, commercial buildings, or green space. Through this lease, they have a resale formula, and the land or buildings can be resold by users for an amount determined by that formula set out in the ground lease, allowing a small profit or limited equity to be made from the sale, but otherwise maintaining and keeping the land affordable. Again, remember rising urban land values. Instead of extracting the value from that, it puts it back into the trust or it captures the rising land value to make sure that the land is made affordable to those who are using it. The other part of the CLT is the governance, right? Resource governance part, and the CLT board is made up of what's called a tripartite structure. 1/3 of leaseholders or people using the land for housing or commercial space or green space and other uses. 1/3 of the general community who live in the area where the CLT operates, but are not leaseholders, and 1/3 of the general public, usually represented by public officials or others that provide funding or have a stake in what is fundamentally our common resource, that is the land and structures, vacant structures. The longest standing example of this is, of course, right in your neighborhood, the Dudley Street CLT, which is decades old now. As you may know, the Dudley Neighborhood Group worked with state and local government to assemble and convey to this what's now called the Dudley Triangle, or 15 acres of vacant lots that were owned by the city, and also help them through eminent domain acquire 15 acres that were privately owned, but most of which had been tax foreclosed. And the trust, with the help of public funds and private foundation grants, developed an urban village consisting of hundreds of affordable housing units, 6 public green common spaces, 2 community centers, an urban farm, refurbished schoolyards, and numerous playgrounds. Again, the area is represented on the right as now controlling over 30 acres of land. They're currently trying to acquire land outside of the triangle. The housing includes 97 home ownership units, 77 limited equity co-ops, 55 rental apartments, and 96 individual homes, the majority of which are targeted for families making between 30 to 60% of the area median income, about 30 to 60,000 for a family of 4. And importantly, the Dudley Street CLT is democratically governed, organized and run so that each cultural ethnic grouping in the neighborhood gets a voice. The board has 35 seats, and of those 20 are reserved for community residents. And of those 20, 4 seats are reserved for African American residents, 4 for Latinx, 4 for those from a Cape Verde heritage, 4 white residents, and 4 for youth. And of the remaining seats are for community development organizations, local religious organizations, partner organizations, small businesses. So again, once elected, the board approves all decisions made by DNSI, by the Dudley Street CLT, and those on the board are elected. So the Dudley Street CLT is, again, the gold standard, some would say, but there are other examples that scale even. Consider Neighbor Space in Chicago. It's an urban land trust that preserves existing community gardens and open space throughout the city, particularly in areas where open space is lacking or vanishing, which tends to occur in underserved areas. Neighbor Space actually was created by 3 government agencies, the city, the Park District, and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, that work together with community leaders, residents, and nonprofits to identify parts of the city where this land was and where they wanted to preserve this space. And so now they manage over 115 plots throughout the city. What's interesting about this example is that once a land grant for a particular lot is established, the government generally relinquishes operational control, right, to local gardeners or community groups that act as stewards over the land. And Neighbor Space, the land trust, operates as a higher level authority. In other words, leaving the real control and management in day-to-day affairs by local members and groups where the land is located. This model, one would say, is an example of a nested, or what Eleanor Ostrom referred to as a nested system, right? A polycentric system of governance in which there are multiple governing arrangements, like individual lots of gardens, operating at different scales with a high degree of independence, but nested in a larger governance structure. And so the rules of the land trust require collective or co-governance over the acquired plots, and are prohibited, in fact, from having a single lead gardener or overseer, but must have multiple leaders, in effect enabling a collaborative governance system, and also presuming, one might add, a certain degree of social capital or social trust. The last example of a CLT I want to give is fitting for the time. We are beginning to see local governments utilize land trust. Can you still see my screen? Okay. Utilize land trust to make bold investments. Okay, to make bold investments in African American communities as a response to systemic racism. The city of Seattle, for instance, recently announced it would transfer $1 million and a decommissioned or withdrawn from service fire station to a local community land trust in a historically Black neighborhood, the Central District. The Africa Community Land Trust, featured on the screen, is a grassroots neighborhood-based land trust in the central area of the city. And the grant will help it develop affordable rental housing, home ownership, and business opportunities, and the Center for Cultural Innovation, which is a collaborative effort between the community and the city's departments of neighborhood and the Office of Planning and Community Development. So the use of community land trusts are a response, one model of stewardship to the need to provide essential goods and services to vulnerable and marginalized communities. And they do so by creating and keeping these resources as common goods off the speculative market, while allowing communities to build goods and collective wealth in what we've called a kind of constructed commons, a commons that doesn't exist in the natural world, unlike the natural commons, but results from a process of bringing together a wide spectrum of actors that work together to co-design and co-produce shared common goods and services at different scales from existing shared urban infrastructure. But coming back to the Co-City project, our empirical project, our work and that of others have identified numerous other kinds of examples of constructed commons, collaboratively produced and governed goods and services that include, as I said, wireless networks, for instance, which is another kind of constructed common, mesh networks, which are decentralized wireless access points connected to each other in a particular area. The most famous one is in Red Hook, Brooklyn. But also there's one in Detroit, which provides connectivity to 40% of its residents, and then in many European cities. But here in the U.S., mesh networking and as well as microgrids and other kind of collectively shared networks that are involve the pooling of urban infrastructure and the combined efforts of many local actors, including the local government, but also private property owners and others. They're designed to create a solution to this last mile connectivity gap. The goal of these networks is to bring internet service to communities and populations that lack high-speed wireless or broadband access, increasingly seen as a necessary utility, right? In this model, no one owns the entire infrastructure. It's open and free. But everyone who wants access can contribute with their resources to run the network, which in turn is managed and governed by the community. It's an example of what Olivier Sylvain calls broadband localism, an approach that seeks to overcome broadband infrastructure and service disparities by race, ethnicity, and income. And this brings me to one of our applications of the Co-City in Harlem through an NSF grant in a city, New York City, that is a smart city, but in which 1/3 of households and families, in particular in African American and Latinx communities, are without access to broadband internet at home. And so our project is to create a community-based disaggregated edge cloud broadband network designed and tested through participatory protocols, which would put the cloud in public housing and other buildings around Harlem. It would also develop and offer low-cost and secure what's called keyboard, video, and mouse devices, KVM devices, to community members as a way to access the applications in the cloud, making those applications accessible to everyone without having to buy programs and put them on a personal computer. And the network will be governed by a shared centralized IT management team and users that will oversee what is a highly secure edge cloud, high-speed broadband network to serve the community. And so these kind of digital constructed commons can be replicated and scaled, we think, if following the principles by which they're adopted, including collective ownership. The network is owned by the community where it's deployed. Collective or collaborative management. The network infrastructure is governed, its rules of use is governed and operated by the community. And open design, the network implementation details are public and accessible to everyone. Open participation, anyone can extend these networks as long as they abide by the network principles and design, and high security and privacy. So these land trust and mesh networks and broadband networks, limited forms of co-housing, community, civic, neighborhood, and shared infrastructure that are co-produced and co-created is what we've seen in cities all over the world. These goods are produced and managed, as the screen shows you, through what we call a number of important mechanisms and hence design principles. They're managed through different forms of pooling and cooperation with at least 5 possible actors. And these include social innovators, which is active citizens, urban regenerators, community gardeners, 2 public authorities or agencies, 3 private or commercial businesses or the private sector, 4 civil society organizations, and 5, importantly, knowledge institutions. Usually we found, and we've been involved in, these kind of constructed commons that depend upon the expertise and the involvement of universities and other knowledge institutions. And public authorities play an important role in facilitating a variety of distributed co-managed structures throughout its territory, enabling communities to actively take part in the regeneration of their neighborhoods and to create shared goods that enable them to sustain themselves and flourish while developing and nurturing the community they belong to. So what's depicted on our screen are our 5 design principles: collective governance or co-governance, enabling state, usually propped up through policy or law and the transfer of resources; social and economic pooling, which I've talked about, the pooling of resources, both financial, knowledge, and technical. Experimentalism, we think these are adaptive, that it's an adaptive model, not a cut and paste model. It's also not a panacea, but what we've noticed that works well is the presence of an adaptive, place-based and iterative approach to designing these innovations that enable the urban commons. And finally, tech justice. We've interestingly found that in many of the examples that we both been involved in, but also have surveyed, highlight access, participation, and co-governance using technological and digital tools as an enabling driver of co-creation of the urban commons. So these principles and characteristics capture the conditions and factors that we observe are present and instantiate the city as a cooperative, collaborative space and infrastructure in which various forms of co-produced and co-managed goods and services, in other words, the urban commons, can not only emerge but are sustainable. I want to use the last 10 minutes to talk about 2 things. One is briefly racial justice in the commons, the link, and the second is to talk about a city that we're involved in, Baton Rouge, applying the co-city approach. One question that people often ask when I present this work, and so I'll address it up front, is the commons a solution to enduring racial and economic inequities that continue to plague so many communities around the world, but particularly here, systemic racism? Can it be a means of repairing historical injustice? We think so, and I think in some of the examples I've shown that it can be a powerful intervention, although certainly not a panacea. The solution that it offers, I think at its core, is reimaginative and redistributive. But importantly, it's got history, right? Some of you may be aware of Jessica Nephard's groundbreaking research, which demonstrates that cooperative ownership mechanisms like land trusts and limited equity ways of holding property have their origins in the fight for Black civil rights and economic equality in America. African Americans have a long and rich history of cooperative ownership in reaction to the failure of markets and the persistence of racial discrimination. And as Amanda Huron's book, if you don't know it, you should get it, more recently explored, that's the use of limited equity cooperatives in Washington, D.C., and largely Black communities as a response to the threat of gentrification. The goal, she writes, is to transform land there that was treated as a commodity from which these communities were in danger of being displaced into land they could exercise some control over, keep accessible to their communities over the long run, even if they could not sell the land on the market. Right? So given how much past injustice is rooted in the dispossession of property and land from indigenous and Black communities, offering these communities the opportunity to control and steward and transfer to their stewardship publicly held land constitutes, I think, a new political imaginary of property relations that's tied neither to public nor private ownership, and which values shared practices of use in community rather than individual possession and profit. So the commons, I think, can be disruptive of a socioeconomic system that has been at the root of so much historical and contemporary justice. And for this reason, I'll end where I start. I have endeavored to apply the co-city model to bring it to the U.S. in communities that are structurally disadvantaged as a result of the historical legacy of racism. In 2019, we were called into a project in Baton Rouge, what I'll refer to as now named Co-City Baton Rouge, to partner with the local redevelopment authority there that renamed itself, rebranded itself because of its problematic history and urban renewal, but was taken over by a local person who was a law professor who is now running this. And their mission, now they're called Build Baton Rouge, is to revitalize a historically African-American area of Baton Rouge called Plank Road, which is represented on the right. Now, for those of you who don't know, the urban metro region of Baton Rouge, which is the capital of Louisiana, has a population of about 800,000. The city parish of what's called East Baton Rouge, the city, has a population of 450 and is about 50% white, 50% African American, more or less, with, of course, a few other groups in there. But Baton Rouge is spatially segregated in what described as a tale of two cities. Its south part holds the most wealth of anywhere in Louisiana, higher quality housing, amenities, transportation. And the north part, where Plank Road is the poorest in Louisiana. Plank Road is a 4-mile area of the city, once a thriving commercial corridor, but over the years has suffered from white flight and a similar disinvestment as other Black communities, as well from deeply flawed urban renewal practices. So just a bit of its history, what you see here is the history of Plank Road and Baton Rouge can be divided into 4 phases. 1, the settlement by First Nations, the cotton cane era, the rise as a petrochemical capital, white flight and disinvestment, which has left a landscape of over 7,800 adjudicated properties, which is a legal term in Louisiana, meaning tax delinquent properties that are adjudicated to the state. So one opportunity in working in Baton Rouge is that the redevelopment agency, now BBR, Build Baton Rouge, has control over 90 adjudicated vacant and unutilized land and structures in Plank Road that are designed to really catalyze a transformation there, right? The Plank Road corridor is bordered mostly by commercial land uses, but residential uses are mostly down their intersecting side streets and extend for several blocks. But sidewalks, as you can see in one of the pictures, are present, though inconsistent, not continuous. The area has the city parish's highest concentration of zero households. But rather, I should say, despite what some call blight, the area is a significant anchor for its surrounding neighborhoods, and it contains a number of assets, including strong social and civic organizations and institutions. So the goals of the project, as you'll see here, a planning firm, Asakura Robinson from New Orleans, came in and engaged in part of what we call our co-city cycle, which goes from cheap talking to mapping to prototyping to modeling, testing, and revising. But in the community engagement phase, you'll see that what was reflected from the community is a desire to protect and grow community wealth. These are their ideas, amplify culture, history, and neighborhood, build streets and neighborhoods that connect people to opportunities. And the focus of the Co-City project there is really to bring this vision, right, and to design institutions, and informal and formal, and to develop a portfolio of innovative community-based institutions that help to bring this to a vision, right, or their vision rather to reality. And so we're doing so by utilizing a project steering committee composed of residents, anchor institutions, local businesses, universities, local nonprofit organizations that are deeply engaged with this project. And the desire is to prevent widespread gentrification in an area that is going to get a bus rapid transit line that's paid for by a huge federal grant, and to create new kinds of goods, housing, an eco park. There's a lot of flooding, micro-entrepreneurial spaces, and new institutions for stewardship of those goods, including a combined land trust land bank. So the collaborative, in fact, was just awarded a few weeks ago one of the highly competitive $5 million Advancing Cities grants from JP Morgan Chase. And this new financing will support ongoing efforts to increase the capacity of that community to continue to engage on the design of these institutions and their governance structures as new investment flows into their community. And I think in closing, it's worth reiterating that the key part of the challenge in working in structurally disadvantaged communities, even in doing something like creating these kinds of common goods, is capacity building. So part of the work in the model is mapping the assets that are available in a community before putting in place a particular institutional design. As decades of community economic development literature has shown, you can leverage existing assets in the community to enable collective solutions by building on existing organizations, relationships, associations, and pairing them with financial and technical assistance to co-produce and co-create the kinds of urban commons that I have referred or have referenced throughout the talk. So our hope is that the Co-City model is or can take root in other American cities that are characterized by persistent racial segregation and economic stratification, forgotten neighborhoods with significant assets and resources that can be leveraged to create new urban commons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. This is so inspiring, and I can see the broad applicability of this model, of the Co-City model in design in so many ways. This is really, it's been a wonderful, your work has been so inspiring, particularly in our Core 4 studio, and I'm sure throughout the school as well, and it will continue to be this way. We have many questions already, and I will begin. I'm going to paraphrase them. Some of them are quite long, so I'll do my best. First question from Daniel Becerra, who explains that the right to the city produces a great concern in that it would favor city development at the expense of the right of the rural to the rural areas, because they also deserve to have proper services, and that this is a main concern related to food security, which would eventually be owned by a few hands. And considering the current COVID-19 challenges related to urban density, would there be a lack of attention to rural areas and their legal protection? And so do you think that the right to the city falls short? And how would the intersection of the urban-rural linkages fit into a concept of the commons?
So very good. I do think the right to the city is a right to one can conceptualize it as a right to not be excluded from the places where people live and are. And I think that can be perhaps stretched to the rural environment. That's not its origins, of course. So I wouldn't dismiss the right to the city either as a conceptual or rhetorical tool, even applied to rural areas, because I think the right is really a substantive right to housing, a right to these goods and services. I personally have moved past, not away from, because I think the right to the city is embedded in the commons, but I think it's more, particularly in light of the rural-urban divide, more appropriate, or the payoff is, I think, more powerful to think about people getting resources and how we take existing landscapes that can be urban or rural, and we can and they can be generative, as I said, right? I think the commons is a generative concept, and so is much more easily translatable to the rural environment.
Next question is from Sheila's law school classmate and everlasting fan, Richard Bray.
Shout out to Richard.
Art is often used as a means to help people think beyond what our space is and creatively imagine and reimagine. What role could and should designate public art spaces play in developing, supporting, and sustaining the city as commons?
So that's a great question. Our Baton Rouge project, actually, art is a big part of it. Art and food, actually, because they're central to the culture there. And so one of the civic organizations that's part of our collaborative, it's called the Walls Project. And the Walls Project is a project that works throughout Baton Rouge to support public art and to sustain art in public spaces as a kind of common good. I mean, that's not their language, but I'm importing my values onto their organizational mission. But basically, we're having a mind meld around that. And so I completely agree. And I think that you see a lot of the tensions and a lot of, so if you think about Banksy, right? If you think about some of the disputes, in particular in urban areas, around who owns the city, right? If I paint art on something and it's a public building, it's not private. I think if it's private, it's an easy answer, but it's not public or it's in transition. What are our claims to that art, right? What is the community's claims? What's the artist's claims? So I do think art is often practically quite central and can be a motivating factor in creating commons and co-producing these goods in communities like Baton Rouge. So for instance, and it's the last thing I'll say, one of the tools that we use in Baton Rouge to reach out to as many community members as possible across, again, a huge community is, or we're through food fairs and art fair, right? Because people down there cook, they have micro food truck businesses. So the creation of a food truck park where people can engage their culture and their art and their talent. So I think it can be quite central.
Okay, Helen Kang, my screen just moved. Very pointed question. Thank you for the informative and transformative talk. Can you point to resources for other communities to adapt the Silicon Harlem project? So
the NSF grant is really a proof of concept. And so, but I think we're proving the concept, and we do think it's scalable. We have a publication that will be published that's kind of a case study that walks you through some of the challenges we have. Helen, I'm happy to share that if you write to me separately, and happy to answer any questions on the project. But we're in our third year of a 3-year proof of concept pilot under the Smart and Connected Cities grant. So the resource, also Silicon Harlem, which is our community anchor group that we're working with. If you go on their website, I think you'll find a lot of resources about the kind of work that they're doing in Harlem as well.
Kathleen Blackstone asks, where do Native Indigenous sovereignty issues place in the conversation regarding the commons? Very important.
So yes, and I've mentioned, dispossession, colonialism in Black communities, but obviously, I think it's fraught and tricky because the commons can be a problematic language when you're talking about the Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons version. If the land that you think is open access was in fact native land and people came and treated it as an open access resource and then dispossessed those communities of that land. So I'm conscious, number one, of the problematic nature of the traditional commons resource or commons language. I think that can it be used in the context of indigenous communities? Of course. I don't know that it's been placed in the conversation about these issues. So I guess that's the short answer, but it could be. But I have to say that I find it a really important conversation to have. One I'm not an expert on, that is to say Indian law and Native and tribal law. I think it's a thick area. I know and talk to a lot of folks and my colleagues at Georgetown, like, Kay-Sue Park and others who do terrific work on this. But I'm just not an expert enough to go further in that question.
Danica Leongson asks actually a two-part question. In investigating examples of the commons around the world, have you observed any patterns or characteristics unique to commons in certain geographic locations versus others? And does seeing the city as a commons rely on a focus on the hyperlocal? Are there more benefits or disadvantages to scaling up co-governance and incorporating into a nationwide policy?
Nationwide, I hadn't thought nationwide. I thought you were going to ask about a slightly smaller scale. I think, so again, we start with Eleanor Ostrom, and her commons were quite small in homogeneous communities. One of the things that we talk about in our book is that when you get into the urban environment and when you scale up, and she had part of this when she looked at water basins, but when you scale up, it gets a lot more complicated, right, to create a commons. Not to mention in her studies to govern one that exists. But when you're talking about creating and the co-governance, I think it gets exceedingly complicated. So the neighborhood space land trust in Chicago, you will notice, is a nested. So, and that was her answer, that when you have a resource on a larger scale and you're nesting, right, different aspects or autonomous elements that are co-governing and collaborating and sharing resources below, that you really do have to be connected to or nest in a larger government structure. And she found that with water districts in California, and we're finding it in something that is citywide, like neighbor space. I mean, you notice there it's 3 local departments in the city that are really governing the land trust. It's not the tripartite structure, but the governance of the individual land in various communities around Chicago is autonomous. So in terms of a national, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. The way that this can connect into national policy is the obvious route is through housing, is to thinking about more forms of housing ownership in a limited equity way that allow people access to ownership, but in ways that don't aggravate the existing ills of, I think, a market economy that has hurt so many people. I mean, interestingly, in Dudley, there were no foreclosures, I believe, after the 2008 crisis. So the model suggests, right, as one of the longest standing urban land trust in what was a structurally disadvantaged and still is community, they were able to hold on to the land trust. Was people were not foreclosed upon. They didn't suffer the same fate that you see in many other cities, from Philadelphia to Miami. In fact, when you overlay the charts of redlined areas from the 40s and 50s on foreclosed areas, in many of these cities, it's a direct overlay. right? So I do think this model in housing can have national implications. We can scale this up that in a way that would give folks a stake, a real financial stake in home ownership, which actually studies have shown people build enough equity and can enter into the regular market if they want to for home ownership. It's an opportunity to build equity, so it's not a trade-off between, do I build the kind of wealth through a single family home ownership on the regular market, or am I locked into this limited equity model? It can be a pathway to that, studies have shown, but it can also create sustainable, secure home ownership and housing. And that part, I think we can create a federal policy around. I think I answered both those questions.
Grant Anderson asks, does government have eminent domain power over CLTs? For example, no. Okay, great.
No, because,
clear answer.
Right, that's no, because these are at the end of the day a private property instrument. Okay. It's a nonprofit entity, but title is held by someone other than the government. It's a nonprofit. So they wouldn't, well, they don't automatically have eminent domain power. So theoretically, could they have eminent domain power over CLT if they wanted to bulldoze their way through a CLT development to do what they did in Kelo, right? The very controversial case that the Supreme Court upheld in Connecticut, in which New London basically imposed eminent domain to clear a few houses, or the expansion of Columbia University in Harlem in New York. I would think it would be very difficult to do. It's not impossible. So let me walk back my no. It's not impossible, but highly unlikely. But again, it's private property to the extent that the government can take private property for the right reason, using the right processes. Theoretically, it's possible.
Okay. Sorry, I am moving in the wrong direction here.
That's good.
Oh, I see. We have several questions from the same people. Okay. What analytical tools and frameworks do you recommend for researching instances of urban commoning? Where do existing frameworks like Ostrom's IAD and its variants fall short in describing and making sense of urban commons and constructed commons in general?
So Christian and I just published a Oxford bibliography on the urban commons with a lot of sources, if you really want to do a deep dive into urban commons. So that's one-stop shop where you can get a list of resources. This is urban commons is actually a new field. In 2015, Christian and I put on the first ever international conference on urban commons under Ostrom's association. It's called the International Association for the Study of the Commons. They had done knowledge commons and other kinds of commons conferences, but not urban commons. So this is really the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a decade, but there's been a real uptick in the past 5 or 6 years. So Amanda Huron's book, there are other books, other edited volumes, and the Oxford bibliography on the urban commons. And constructed commons is a term that comes out of the knowledge commons literature. There's books and articles on knowledge commons. We borrow it from the knowledge commons. That's one pivot away from Ostrom, in a sense. And we borrow it because it's less about an existing resource that has the elements of traditional commons and more about a different kind of shared resource that doesn't have those elements.
Okay. Federico Bernal, do you have examples on how to create a CLT in informal settlements, say, for instance, in Latin America?
So there is the first CLT in an informal settlement happened in Puerto Rico. There is a book that just came out, and I'm sorry, I'm going to reach into my On Common Ground. I'll show it to you. It's called On Common Ground, International Perspectives on Community Land Trust. It has all the examples that you will need about CLTs internationally. There is a group, Catalytic Communities, in Rio is, so you may know them.
They do great work.
Right. Yeah, and they are looking into placing one of the favelas into a land trust. Of course, it's complicated outside the U.S. because after land reform, a lot of those folks have titles, so they would actually have to transfer their titles, not the state transferring land. They would have to transfer land into the land trust. And so there's a terrific article by Teresa Williamson, who runs Catalytic Communities, in, I believe it's Landlines, and it's all about CLTs in the context of the urban South and informal settlements, and how she thinks they're different than Western or global North CLTs.
Sadie Coughlin, how do the stakeholders, organizers of projects such as Silicon Harlem address the privacy surveillance concerns that come with public networks from local community members, especially those living in public housing, an already overly policed and surveyed population who have historical distrust to these kinds of projects and technologies?
So one of the great things about the edge cloud technology is it's not a public network. It is literally, so Microsoft lent dozens of servers for this. And so I'm more worried about Microsoft than the public in that sense. But no, in all seriousness, the edge cloud server itself is placed in the building, and it's the cloud just for that building. So the governance around the edge cloud network, and it's a network only because it's a network of servers, but it's much more secure actually than the servers we use today. The privacy concerns actually are quite complicated, and I'm not working on those, but my colleagues who are part of the project are. But one of the things that is different, and why the surveillance issue isn't as much as an issue, is that because it is a good that is basically governed and controlled by the people who are using it and accessing it. Now, that raises other questions that I think we haven't all, that we have not worked out actually fully yet. Again, happy to answer questions about that to the extent that I can, or point you into the right direction on members of our team that are working on that.
Okay, next question. How large of a space or how many people do you think is possible to effectively steward? I ask because I wonder what the borders of these stewardship communities would become, both physically and psychically. Would they be, by definition, isolated from others? Who would be allowed in after the definition was created? Would they be defined by change or a laid out initial vision for stewardship?
All complicated questions. The short answer, I think, in speaking to a graduate school of design, I see these, there are certain legal questions like privacy and surveillance, and there are certain design questions. These are classic, I think, design questions, how you design these institutions, depending on scale, depending on capacity, depending on the kinds of relationships, you know, communities have both within and with each other. They don't always work, right, in all places. And certainly they shouldn't be things that aggravate, I think, social isolation or stratification. In fact, you know, I think romantics of the commons think that they'll bring people of different, you know, communities that are not like each other, either racially or economically, together. You see some of that with community gardens around cities. But I think when you start to get to more material resources like housing and businesses and like a food incubator that we're doing in Baton Rouge. I'm not sure that that's their main purpose, is to connect people outside of their communities. That may happen, but that's not their main purpose. But I think the answer to all of your questions is that they're good questions, and these are really design issues. Our co-city framework is very adaptive, but iterative, and it's got to be landed in particular places. And all of these questions have to be addressed, which is why it's a tremendous and complicated process that takes years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are the benefits of this approach to community building, property rights, and the economic value of people scalable? Do networks of co-cities interact and reach beyond the local? At an international level, is there a comparison to be made to entities such as the EU or other regional cooperative groups?
So the reason LabGov is international is because we try to create a platform for different co-cities to come together. So for instance, a few years ago, 2016, I believe it was, Rockefeller Foundation hosted all of the emerging co-cities and others in its Bellagio facility to spend a few days comparing their experiences. And mostly these were European and American cities. And then at the time, we were working in Accra, Ghana, also an African city. So it is our thought that eventually this would be a network of cities, much like smart cities are now conferences and networks, but it hasn't happened yet. And in an international level, is there a comparison maybe between entities such as the EU or other regional cooperative groups? I'm not quite sure what that's getting at. But as you know, part of my profile is that I chair the advisory board of the Global Parliament of Mayors. So some of this work spills over into mayoral networks and city networks, which are quite active, both at the international level, but also at the regional level. African mayors, EU cities, or Euro cities. And there's, depending on the network, quite a lot of interest in these alternative frameworks, or these different frameworks about development in their cities in ways that are more equitable and sustainable.
On the other end of things, Robert Plitt asks, could Sheila dig in a bit more on the role of the private sector in this model?
I always say someone has to fund the commons. And, one important part of urban economics is that cities are, cannot fund themselves fully. They don't get enough. So I'm just talking about U.S. cities for now. They don't get enough federal aid. The amount of federal aid has declined over time from the 70s until now. They are made powerless, I think, by having to chase mobile capital. See the Amazon competition. And if you're talking about building in a socially justice way, the resources are even scarcer. There's social impact investing and all kinds of bonds, but talk to any of the folks I work to in these cities and they'll say that people will talk to you, but they're still money-making ventures, right? That don't always pan out if you want to do racial or social justice work. Having said that, we have funded this work through, as you know, grants, philanthropic, NSF, JP Morgan Chase, local foundations in Baton Rouge, but increasingly, certain kinds of private businesses are wanting to become a part of the community building process. So I would distinguish between local private businesses. So in Plank Road, it's a commercial area. There are local private businesses. They're part of the community and they should be treated as such. So the private sector is exceptionally important, that private sector to this, but also for larger projects that scale larger, such as the Harlem Project, it turns out that, we have relied upon, again, Microsoft to donate the servers. So our pooling economies, right, the pooling economy as opposed to the agglomeration economy, the pooling economy presupposes that we can and should find funding from a variety of sources, but that's to say not to let that funding define what we're doing. I don't think in reality, if you're talking about trying to build these communities in a way that get people goods and become, proactive in doing so, it's very hard for me to see how you sidestep the market. And you know what? That's even so. If you go to Africa, it's even so, because there's so many problems at the national level with money and funding that increasingly, social entrepreneurs and innovators in a place like Accra are partnering with the private sector there, because they're the ones that are most nimble and can bring the most change and will invest in those communities.
Okay, and one last question as we're now getting to the hour. From our own faculty, Gareth Doherty, could you talk about the difference between commons and communes? Could urban communes such as Christiania in Copenhagen be understood as a commons?
Perhaps we have to define that term, right? I don't know that particular commune. People often think I'm talking about communes when I say the commons. It's a term, which is why we use co-city in part to just reduce the number of times that we have to really unpack a complicated concept. But I'll tell you what it's not. And I think the commons is between the market and the state. I think we have to be incredibly careful about equating private communities that are self-governing with what I understand to be the commons, which is to say highly privatized property and holding. So people can live on a commune that's all privately owned. And they may share a community and goods within them, what one property scholar calls commons on the inside, private property on the outside, but they can exclude and do exclude others, actually. So I'm highly skeptical about using the term in such a capacious way that it involves basically what is a private collective property with all of the legal entitlements bundled in just the property owners who can act like any other private property regime and exclude, dispose of at whatever level and way that they want. To me, that would be my dividing line. Again, I don't know much about that commune, but if it maps onto more of a private community, then I would problematize it as the kind of commons that I'm talking about.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much to the audience. Before closing, I'd like to also give a thanks to Paige Johnston, Matt Smith, Kat Chavez from the Communications Office for having organized and helped make a great public programs for the fall semester. And I'm sure the one in the springs will be equally fantastic. And thank you to Sheila Foster for joining us tonight, for your inspiring work. And we look forward to seeing more of it in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. And hopefully many questions will be answered in our MIT Press book that's forthcoming.
We look forward to the book.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor.